The topic of resilience looms, I think, it's always been important, but it looms larger and larger. I say always been important. Well, so for example, we have known, there's been research for years, that if you had to pick between brains and perseverance, you'd want perseverance more often than brains. It'd be nice to have both, but there's a lot of smart people who don't stick to what they're supposed to do and have a hard time if things don't go their way. You know? I told the faculty this morning that Garrison Keillor on the Prairie Home Companion said a couple of years ago that intelligence is just like four-wheel drive. It just enables you to get stuck in more remote places. And there's a lot of very smart people who have a hard time, you know, getting to work in the morning. So we've always known that it was important. But in an age when it's harder to know, so is this the right road? Or is my child, when she grows up, going to have to do this and then that and then something else? Then the capacity to persevere, the capacity to bounce back from adversity and from uncertainty, then gets correspondingly much more important. And what I always think of when we start to talk about this is that my sense about the importance of this is that most of us, I think if we were honest, we would have to admit that the most important, let me ask you this, I'll see if you will admit it. I say to you, what are the most important lessons you have learned in your life so far? The deepest and the most profound lessons. And how did you learn those? I think the odds are that most of us learned them in a context of loss or disappointment or even failure, and not because we won the lottery. And we might wish we could have done the learning without the loss or the disappointment or the failure, but that's not how life works. That's why English teachers, which I used to be, make kids read poems and novels and plays. That's what they're about, loss and learning. And what's going to distinguish your children as they go through life is not whether some of these things happen to them, but what they do when it happens. And I think, this is not new, we've always known this. I think the challenge is it's a lot harder to think about how we could help and let them learn what they need to learn so they're ready to adapt and to cope when hardship happens or errors happen or mistakes happen or whatever, and to figure out how they're going to be able to do that. So I want to suggest to you that a couple of things. First, there is a simple way to think, two simple ways to think about resilience. And one is that we actually, as the concept has gotten to be more important, we've tried to figure out what we can do to promote it. But at the very beginning, psychologists have always known that there are some kids who just seem to come out with more of it. In the old days, 50 years ago, these kids used to be called psychologically hardy. It was an old phrase they used to use. Some kids just seem to shrug it off and pick themselves up, and other kids seem more fragile and more easily wounded. If you have more than one, you probably have one who's more this way and one who's more that way. Yes? Right. One who's more sensitive, one who cries more readily, one who's more deeply wounded by an insult or something, and another one who seems to be, even if temporarily upset, sort of better able to kind of pick her or himself up and just go back to it. And we don't actually know what produces that, but we know there are those differences.